Alright, welcome back to another fun week of Trig Online. Today we are going to tackle some of the problems that we did together on Friday. And we are going to, let me get this going here, because we are going to really be using quite a bit these identities right here. Referring back to this page a lot. So to start with, the first question is to simplify cosecant times tangent. So let's write that out. Cosecant t times tangent t. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to rewrite cosecant as 1 over sine. So that is 1 over sine t. And then I'm going to rewrite tangent as sine over cosine. So this would be, come on now, this would be times sine over cosine. And so that's really not that bad at all, because I know it's hard to see the way I'm writing out these fractions, but this sign is on the bottom, this sign is on the top. So these two would cancel, and that leaves me with the 1 on top from the first fraction divided by the cosine on the bottom for the second fraction, which we can then go back to our little chart here and see that 1 over cosine is secant. So in the end, my final answer is secant of t. Oops. Okay, exciting stuff. All right, let's try another one. Let's go secant of t, this time divided by the cosecant of t. So I have to make my fractions a little better here. So that's going to be 1 divided by, secant is 1 over cosine. And then that's all divided by 1 divided by cosecant is 1 over sine. So let me clean that up a little bit so it looks more mathy. So here's what I got going. Got 1 over cosine, that's a fraction, 1 over sine, that's a fraction, and these two things are being divided. Okay? So now we're going to go back to our whatever 6th grade rules are, where we know that if you divide two fractions, what you're really doing is you're multiplying by the reciprocal. So I'm going to take the top function, which is 1 over cosine t, and multiply that by the reciprocal of this, which would be, let's see, this is a fraction. Multiply that by the reciprocal of 1 over sine t, which would be, of course, sine t over 1. And then if I multiply those together, I end up with sine t divided by cosine t, which, if we look back here, is, where are we, sine over cosine is tangent. So we've changed that secant divided by cosecant and rewritten it as tangent. And there should be an equal sign also. Okay. Alright, not so bad. Okay, let's play again. So secant t minus cosine. I'm going to rewrite secant as 1 over cosine t minus, I'm going to rewrite cosine as cosine over 1. I'm going to write this whole thing over sine. So this is a fraction, this is a fraction, and this whole thing is a fraction. Okay, so now I'm going to get a common denominator of the things on top. So this is going to equal, my common denominator here is going to be cosine, so this already has a cosine on the bottom, so I'm just going to leave that as 1 over cosine of t minus, then to get this to have a cosine on the bottom, I have to multiply by a cosine on the top. So that's going to change this cosine on top into cosine squared. And then the reason we did that is so that we could get a cosine on the bottom. And then remember that this is still all being divided by the sine of t. So 1 over cosine, cosine squared over cosine, and then all of this over sine. Alright, so here's where things start to get fun. I mean, that's a silly thing to say, they've been so much fun already. So then, since I have a common denominator, I can rewrite this now as 1 minus cosine squared of t over plain old cosine of t, and that is again still divided by sine of t. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that top thing, 1 minus cosine squared, and I'm going to think about my original Pythagorean identity, which is that, why am I writing this by hand? Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And what I want to do is I want to think about if I were to subtract cosine squared from both sides, what I would end up with. And that would be, if I subtract cosine squared, the cosine squared is gone from here. And so let's do this the right way. And so that would leave me with sine squared on the left and 1 minus cosine squared on the right. So you can see from this that it's just a little simple math. If I take sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, I can switch that around pretty quickly to show that 1 minus cosine squared is equal to sine squared. So that's what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to replace this stuff on top, this 1 minus cosine squared, and make that into a plain old sine squared. Oops. Still over plain old cosine, and all of that is still over sine. So I've simplified this top piece into sine squared, and then we're still dividing by that. Okay, now I'm going to use that simple old trick that when you divide by a fraction, you really just multiply by the reciprocal. So I'm going to take sine squared of t divided by cosine of t, and I'm going to multiply that by the reciprocal of sine of t, which is 1 over the sine of t. So again, this is a fraction, this is a fraction, and they're being multiplied together. Alright, so then we're almost done here. This sign on the bottom cancels with one of these signs on the top, leaving us with just a sine of t. Then there's nothing to be done with the cosine, so in the end I'm left with in the end I have sine over cosine, which if I go back and look at that chart on the other page, I know that that equals tangent. So what we did there is we took that crazy fraction from the very beginning and simplified it all the way down to just equal tangent. Good stuff. All right, 3 down, 7 to go. No big deal. All right, so our approach for this one is going to be the same. I'm going to take both cotangent and tangent, and I'm going to turn them into fractions using sine and cosine. And then I'm going to get a common denominator. I'm going to use that common denominator to write both the top and the bottom of my original fraction as a single fraction. And then I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. Okay. So let's do that right now. Okay, so the 1 plus cotangent is going to become 1, it's going to become, that's fine. So 1 plus cotangent is going to become, cotangent is cosine over sine. So that's going to be 1 plus cosine t divided by sine of t. And then on the bottom, the 1 plus tangent is going to become 1 plus cosine t divided by sine of t. Okay, so again we got some fractions going on here that we need to make sure we understand. So cosine over sine is a fraction because that came from cotangent. This whole thing is a fraction because the problem started as a fraction, and then cosine over sine is also a fraction. Alright, so then to get a common denominator on top, that's going to be sine. It's going to be our denominator. So this 1 right here is going to change into sine t divided by sine t. And then I still have, maybe I can be fancy here, let me see if yeah, that's not good. Then I still have, really, over here, cosine of t divided by sine of t. Ooh, where am I even going with this? Divided by, okay, this 1 right here is going to become, since I want a common denominator, oh, I did this wrong. Cotangent is cosine over sine, tangent is sine over cosine. That explains it. So this should be a cosine on the bottom, that should be a sine on top. Okay. Alright, so that means then that these are two separate fractions, but they now have a common denominator. This is all over. I'm going to get a common denominator down here. Make this 1 is going to turn into cosine over cosine. And the top is going to stay, I'll get a plus in there, top is going to stay as sine r cosine. Right? So fraction. Okay, so common denominator on top means that, oh, I see where this is going. Okay, so common denominator on top is means that I can now write this as sine of t plus cosine of t all divided by sine of t. And then on the bottom we get cosine of t plus sine of t divided by cosine of t. Okay. Alright, so then again, as promised, we're now going to take this and do the multiply by the reciprocal thing. So the fraction on the top stays the same. And then we're going to go times the fraction on the bottom flipped over. the cosine of t is on the bottom, and cosine t plus sine t. So the cosine t from the bottom comes to the top, and this stuff from the top goes to the bottom because we're multiplying by the reciprocal. Hopefully you can see where we're headed with this. And where we are headed with this is that now this and this both cancel. And so that leaves us with the simple fraction cosine over sine, which we can then write as, that must be cotangent. And we're done with that. Okay. Alright, 6 to go. Ooh, some squared things. This is actually the easiest problem ever in the world, because all of you know that sine squared, no matter what the variable is, plus cosine squared is equal to 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole thing on top, and I'm going to replace that with a 1. So, very first step simplifies this problem to 1 over cosine squared of t. And then since we know that 1 over cosine is secant, that tells us that 1 over cosine squared is secant squared. Done. Easy as pie. 5 more, halfway there. Okay, so now we're on to proving some identities. So what I'm going to do to start with this one is one of my problem-solving strategies is that if I have 2 fractions that are equal to each other, I can cross-multiply those 2 fractions. So if I multiply this way, if I multiply sine squared times 1, then I'm going to get sine squared. I am not going to do a theta, I'm going to just stick with t. And then that's going to equal what I get when I multiply the other way around. So that's 1 plus cosine t times 1 minus cosine t. Okay, so let's leave the sine squared on this side alone. And then let's FOIL this out. So first times first is 1. Outside times outside is minus cosine t. Inside times inside is plus cosine t. And last times last is cosine squared of t. Okay? Alright, so again, the stuff on the left stays as sine squared. The stuff here in the middle is going to cancel. So that would leave me with 1 minus cosine squared. And then, like you saw on the other screen back here, we talked about if you start with sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, you can pretty easily switch that around to make it 1 minus cosine squared equals sine squared. So, do that over here. The sine squared on the left stays as sine squared, and then 1 minus cosine squared is also sine squared. So we have proven that those 2 things are the same. Okay? 13, 14, 15, 16. All right, 4 to go. Alright, so when I see this, this makes me want to change everything into sine and cosine to start with. So secant is 1 over cosine. minus, oh, I guess this is just going to stay as cosine, and then that equals sine, which stays as sine, times tangent, which I'm going to rewrite as sine over cosine. Okay, so let's make sure we know which ones of these are fractions. 1 over cosine is a fraction because that came from secant. Cosine is fine just like that. Sine is fine just like that. And then tangent is sine over cosine, so that's a fraction also. Okay, so what should we do now? Well, when we multiply these two things together, I got, oh no, those signs are both on top. I should be writing all of these as fractions. That's a little confusing. Let me switch that around. So this is really sine over 1 and this is really cosine over 1. I thought I could do some canceling there the way those were written before, but I cannot. Okay, so this I'm going to do the old common denominator game with. Denominator. Make the denominator cosine. So the 1 over cosine already has a denominator of cosine. And then to make this one over here have a denominator of cosine, I'm going to have to multiply the top by cosine also, so that makes that into cosine squared, and then on the bottom I have cosine, and then for the fraction here on the right, I'm going to say sine times sine is sine squared, and 1 times cosine is cosine. Alright, so let's fraction these bad boys up. This is a fraction, this is a fraction, and that's a fraction. Okay, so now I got a common denominator here, so I can write the top as 1 minus cosine squared, and that is over cosine of t. And then that still equals sine squared over cosine. Okay, so this is a fraction, and that's a fraction. Okay, so then essentially what I can do from here is I can multiply both sides by cosine. And if I do that, this cosine and this cosine will cancel, this cosine and this cosine will cancel, and that will leave me with 1 minus cosine squared on the left equals sine squared on the right. And we've already talked about a number of times that 1 minus cosine squared is really equivalent to sine squared. So we're left with sine squared equals sine squared, so we're done. Okay, 3 more. Oh my lord. Well, let's see. All right. So I got myself a cosecant squared here, which is a sine that maybe I want to look at one of these identities that has branched off from sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, this guy right here. So let's use this. So what did I have again now? Cosecant squared. So if I look at this, cosecant squared is cotangent squared plus 1. Ooh. I don't know if that's going to help me at all. Cotangent is cosine over sine. Cosine. Oh, I guess we could back. Oh, okay. We're back. Got it. All right. Never mind. Not doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by taking cosecant squared minus sine squared, and I am going to factor it. So I'm going to make this cosecant of x minus sine of x times cosecant of x plus sine of x. And that's still over cosecant of x plus sine of x equals the stuff we have on the left, or on the right, which is cosine of x times cotangent of x. Alright. And this is a fraction. Okay, so now this and this cancel. So that leaves me with cosecant of x minus sine of x equals cosine of x times cotangent of x. And I wonder if that is something that we've done before. Did we do something with cosine and cotangent in one of these other problems? Somewhere, please? Oh, cosecant and tangent, rats. Okay, so we got to mess around with this a little bit. So once we get to this point, it's always a good idea to just change everything into sine and cosine. So I'm going to go 1 over cosecant is the same as 1 over the sine of x minus, I'm going to rewrite sine of x as sine of x over 1, so it's less confusing, so everybody's a fraction, equals, let's do the same thing with cosine, let's write that as cosine of x over 1, and let's rewrite cotangent as cosine over sine. Okay. Alright, so I actually should be able to see where we're going with this from here. Here I'm going to get a common denominator, which is going to be sine of x. So this already has the sine of x on the bottom, so I need to multiply the top and the bottom over here by sine of x. So if I do that, I have 1 over sine of x minus, this becomes sine squared of x over sine of x, because I was trying to get that common denominator there. And then I can simplify this. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared, and that's over sine. So again, I think we should be able to see from here the light at the end of the tunnel, because these all have signs on the bottom, so all of the signs cancel each other out. So then on the left, I just have 1 minus sine squared of x, and on the right, I have cosine squared x, and we already have showed a couple of different times that those two things are the same. So we're done. Alright, time for a new color. Ooh, let's go purple. Alright, so let's try the same deal here. I'm going to take the top and I'm going to factor it, because that is the difference of two squares. So that's cosecant of x minus 1 times cosecant of x plus 1 divided by cosecant squared minus cosecant. I'm going to factor a cosecant out of that. So if I factor cosecant out of cosecant squared, that leaves me with cosecant. And if I factor a cosecant out of cosecant, that leaves me with 1. And so that all equals 1 plus sin. And a key tenemos one fraction. Okay, so cosecant of x minus 1 and cosecant of x minus 1 cancel. So that's a pretty good start. That has simplified things a lot. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what's left and I'm going to continue that strategy of writing everything in terms of sine and cosine. So cosecant of x becomes 1 over sine of x. Then I still have this 1 here, which in order to get that as a common denominator, I'm going to make that be sine over sine instead of being 1. And then cosecant on the bottom is also 1 over sine. Okay. And then that all equals 1 plus sine of x. And a new car for you, a new car for you, a new car for you, and a new car for you. Okay, so this is, on top here, since I have a common denominator, I can write that as 1 plus sine of x over sine of x. And then that is, let's see, still divided by 1 over sine of x. So what I'm going to do, I'll just kind of simplify here since there's like nobody watching this anyway, and rewrite 1 over sine of x as sine of x over 1. So I'm just going to, in one step here, turn this into multiplying by the reciprocal, eurofraction and eurofraction. Then these two things cancel, and that leaves me with 1 plus sine of x here, which is what I was trying to get it to equal in the first place, so I'm calling her good. Okay, last one. Oh, this is an easy one. I got two fractions equal to each other. My problem-solving strategy for that is to cross multiply. Let's go with the grossest color I can find. How about this? Super pale green. So if I cross multiply these, that would be 1 plus cosine u times 1 minus cosine u equals sine u times sine u, which is sine squared of u. And then when I FOIL 1 plus cosine out times 1 minus cosine, then that gets me 1 minus cosine squared of u. And I want that to equal sine squared of u, which it does. So I am done. Whoops, hey, u. Okay, that's all I have for you today. I will be back tomorrow, and we will do section 5.5, which let's take a little preview and see what that's on, so you guys can all get excited. 5.5, right triangle trigonometry. Kind of thought that's what we were doing already. putting this on triangles. Okay, that looks, ooh, yeah, no, I don't like that very much, cofunctions. Okay. Oh, yeah, then we get to find out how tall a tree is, things like that. Do some word problems, SOHCAHTOA, yeah, get pumped about that. Alright, so to the one person out there, whoever you are, that's actually watching at least 10 seconds of this video, see you tomorrow.